Matt's here because I would call him a distinguished alum of the political science department, and he has an array of experience of which I think he'll talk about all of it a little bit, and so you can, if there's some of it that interests you more, I think the Q&A would be a time to push him to talk about some of this more than others, but he's got an array of experience that includes involvement in political campaigns. That was what he did right out of college, and political consulting work that transitioned to work in Washington and in other consulting capacities, and then work on Capitol Hill with particularly with Senator Mitt Romney and Mitt Romney's presidential campaigns. And then since that time, in more recent years, he's been involved in some venture capital business things that investing and other things that I don't know much about. So you can ask him about it. What I would tell you about Matt that's helpful for you to understand him as a student is that I knew Matt when he was a student, but I didn't have him in any of my classes. You were never in a class of mine. I met him because he came and knocked on my door or sent me an email and then showed up asking for my help with something. And that little project, the way I would characterize that is that Matt and a friend named Ryan basically took over the college Republicans at BYU and used it as an opportunity to basically recruit what I would say were hundreds, 770 BYU students to go work on Republican congressional campaigns in both 2004 and 2006, if I remember right. You guys were doing this for 2 cycles. Back in that day, the Republican Party had an interesting approach to what is called the ground game, or the period of time before Election Day when you're mobilizing voters. And one of the things they were doing was recruiting people to go and sort of fly in and stay in the campaign in the 72 hours before Election Day and just work a lot of hours at knocking doors. And what they discovered, thanks I think to Matt and Ryan's work, was that BYU students were really good at this, in part due to the fact that there were a lot of people on campus then and now that had a lot of experience going door to door and talking to strangers about whatever difficult topic you might want to talk about, right? And that in furthermore, the BYU students didn't get drunk, they worked long hours, they handled rejection really well, all traits that...
Did steal a car, though.
Stole a car once. Okay, one student stole a car? You stole a car? Okay. In any case, pretty hot commodity, and what I learned about from Matt was that I learned about this going on from I was teaching political science 110 at the time and had several hundred students, and I was getting all these emails from some of my students saying, I'm going to be out of town in this class. Is that okay? And I was like, well, what are you doing? Oh, I'm going to go work for Republican candidates. Oh, tell me more. And then I talked to a few of them, and I basically said, all right, I'll be fine with you doing this. What I want when you come back is I want you to come to my office and tell me everything. I want to know what you're doing. Like, I want you to take pictures if you can, keep copies of scripts. Anything they ask you to do, I want you to make a few notes. And then when you come back, tell me about it. And I learned all about it. And then a few days later, Matt and Ryan showed up, and they had basically been entrepreneurial enough to write their own survey to ask their volunteers about their experience so that they could figure out how it went and how to improve it. And I was super impressed about 2 students that didn't have any training in survey research that wrote a pretty darn good questionnaire, figured out how to collect data, and just wanted to know what I thought of their survey and if I had insights from their data. I still have your data, by the way. I could put my hands on it right now. I know right where it is in my office. I'm that kind of pack rat. But pretty impressive, okay? What I want to leave as a lesson that's my way of introducing Matt is that and it's one of your assignments, right, if you're doing the political science experiences, is you're supposed to go visit with a professor. I had a friendship that started with Matt because he knocked on my door, and I thought what he was doing was pretty interesting, and I was more than happy to listen. As many, if not, I won't say all, because I can't guarantee all of my colleagues will be receptive, but I would say the vast majority of my colleagues, if you knocked on their door and said, I want to talk about something that I know you know about, they would say, come on in and sit down, or I can't do it now, but let me put you on my calendar. I'll be happy to talk to you about it. They're really eager to meet students. I think it did Matt some good to have that conversation, and it did me some good, and I think it's well worth your time. I'll repeat it again. If you're not visiting with every professor for every class every semester, you're doing it wrong. You should be visiting one-on-one with every professor for every class every single semester. Work us hard. Come to our office hours. And in many cases, you could come multiple times. And I will say, I haven't seen many of you in my office yet, so there's an opportunity there for you. And then, without further ado, let me introduce Matt Waldrip.
Thank you. Just testing. They gave me a microphone, so I'll make sure it works, but I don't see anybody checking it. So
it's working.
All right. A couple of things. One, just to that grand introduction here, and we'll make this very conversational because there's a small enough group here that we can do that. One distinction, in order to keep BYU off our back on that experience that you talked about where we sent out 770 students to these different campaigns, we advertised just that you could go campaign. We didn't say Republican or Democrat. And if somebody signed up and said, I want to help on Democratic campaigns, we also funneled them there, which was like anybody else that worked in politics at the time and now, it's like, you did what? You helped the other side? It was as much about just engaging in the process as it was about the candidates there. And that was, as I look back on that, that was an interesting learning for me at that time. So I did work in politics for a long time, mostly with Mitt Romney. And it started on both his presidential campaigns, and then after he lost to President Obama in 2012, I stuck around with him. I was like the one guy that kind of stuck around and kept doing things, and that meant all sorts of a variety of different things, and mostly on the business side. And then when that transitioned, and when his life transitioned to going back into government, I went with him. So I was his campaign manager out here in Utah for a Senate campaign, and then I was his chief of staff in Washington. And then after a few years of that, a few years of public service, I, of course, answered to the higher calling of private equity, which is my go-to joke these days. So I'm trying to think how to best structure this to make it actually meaningful. Like, I know you're taking this as a class, and I guess it might be interesting, but I have taken a great interest in my life in connecting with people and making the case particularly to young people to get involved in political campaigns and in politics at every level. I have a very strong working thesis on why this matters. And I'm going to state it, and then we're going to kind of go backwards and come for some questions. My stated thesis is why it matters to work on political campaigns at any level, presidential down to mayoral races, down to city council and school board races, is campaigns, all the way up to the highest level, presidential campaigns, are run by people under 30 years old. Like 98% of the staff are run by people under 30 years old. So what does that mean? You get an outsized responsibility at a very young age. You're 22 years old or whatever the case is, and you are calling, depending on what campaign you're working on, you're calling senators, you're calling mayors, you're calling big business leaders. When I was working on Mitt Romney's campaigns, I remember making phone calls to business leaders because primarily what I did in his second campaign, where he ended up being the Republican nominee, was fundraising. I was the deputy finance director, so my job was to manage the national fundraising. At that point in time, it was a $1 billion campaign, $1 billion raised. That is now small numbers compared to what's happening these days, but it's $1 billion. And I remember calling business leaders, the CEO of you name it company, the big hedge fund manager, and they're picking up my phone call, they're texting me back, and I'm like, if I had gone the route that you normally go to work at Goldman Sachs or something, I'll just use that as an example, this guy that I'm talking to right now, who's texting me, who's wanting to stay in touch with me, who's strategizing with me as a 25-year-old, wouldn't he feel comfortable knowing that we lived on the same planet? But because I was his access point to politics, which for a lot of people is like a drug. And there's good reason for that. Once you get further along in the business or in civic society, you recognize how important it is to engage in politics. They're saying, I'll take any route I can. I'll tell you, I'm going to divert and tell a fun story here. For Christmas a couple years ago, I gave Mitt Romney an awesome gift. I'm going to reference a movie that none of you have ever seen, but it's a movie called Oh Brother, Where Art Thou? Has George Clooney, some head nods on George Clooney. Okay, George Clooney, former Hollywood A-lister. He'd probably cry if he heard that description given to him today. Like, he was top of the list at one point in time. This is Mitt Romney's favorite movie. He loves this movie.
It's legitimately great.
It's a great movie, for some. I like it. And so what did I do? For Christmas, Mitt Romney unwraps this thing that's in a tube, and he opens it up, and it's an Oh Brother, Where Art Thou poster. And it's signed by George Clooney. And he has a really funny thing on there. He says, from one dapper Dan man to another, which is a reference to the movie, how they both have like slick hair, which Mitt Romney has really slick hair. And then underneath he says, you know, I think Merry Christmas, and then George Clooney, and then underneath that in parentheses, 2 times sexiest man alive, which I thought was unbelievable. He was People Magazine's sexiest man alive twice, which I thought was awesome. Why do I tell a story? I got to know George Clooney, and I got him to do this Christmas present for me because during the first impeachment of Donald Trump, somehow George Clooney found my information, and he wanted an inside track on what was going on. I was, you know, not giving him anything I shouldn't, but I was going back and forth with George Clooney like 15 times a day on what was happening because he just wanted to know. And he respected Mitt Romney. He respected that Mitt Romney might be an independent voice on this, but it was never him giving propaganda on what Mitt Romney should do or shouldn't do in this. It was him being like, what does this mean? I saw this. How are the senators really paying attention? Do they care about this? Whatever. So that's just a fun example of the exposure you get in politics in a really unique way. So I want to get as much as we can into, checking the time, into letting you ask questions and trying to drive towards actually maybe using some of this time to have you move forward in your careers. This sounds like my wife is in the back and she's going to be like, oh boy. I'll give out my contact information. Feel free to contact me all you want if it's about careers and getting in the political world. And I absolutely mean it, and I absolutely will follow up. And the only reason I think my wife is rolling her eyes back there is just because that makes me sound super important and I'm going to help you out. But no, I really do want to help. I really want to help. Okay, so there's a couple different routes of things we can talk about that I think might set things up. We could talk about what the heck is going on in politics today? Like, what is going on in the world? What is going on in our country? I feel like I can't not talk about that just a little bit today, even if it's just interesting. I know we're supposed to be talking about careers, but we've got to talk about it a little bit. We could talk, you know, what is this Trump presidency? What is it a result of? What's it going to be? We've got to just spend a little time on that. So we'll talk a little bit about that, but mostly what I want to do, just as a quick like, I guess background would be one way to put it, on my very lucky and very unique career, is I want to first mention what I learned, and then I'll go backwards. And I want to mention the most important lesson that I learned through this. And then we'll go backwards and talk about how I got into it. I had a 15-year career with Mitt Romney. For the first time in 15 years, I am not under his employment, but I actually sort of feel closer to him now than I ever have, and he's now retired. So, but the relationship has stayed strong. So I want to first give the most important lesson. That lesson starts maybe with the following. And I think we've all probably heard this in social or other settings, which is effectively someone saying, I really shouldn't tell you this, but. Or I see this a lot of time. Now I work in real estate investments, and a lot of times it's like, well, I can't say this to my partners, or my partners wouldn't want me telling you this, or my boss wouldn't want me telling you this, but. And then what follows is some information that you'd be really interested in. Well, unless you're a dummy, are you going to trust that person? Like, if they're going to do that to their boss, their partners, their spouse, their friends, or whatever, you know that your secret is not safe with them, right? So I saw this as sort of a pattern, particularly in the world of politics. And I always noticed it, and I'm like, what is this person thinking? Like, don't they know that we're going to know each other for longer than this 1 week period that we're interacting right now? And it was all summed up to me again by Mitt Romney, my boss of a long, long time. And it came through an experience where I was driving him around DC, going to some event. I don't know what it was. It was awesome. I had my wife's car that she had when she was here at BYU, missing hubcaps. The passenger side door handle didn't exist. It was a great car to drive this guy that everyone thinks is a fancy guy around town in. But we're going to some event, and if you've ever been to DC, there's Reagan National Airport, actually, which has just unfortunately been in the news for the helicopter plane crash recently, but you'll see that's right on the river. There's a park right by that river, and you can sit in that park, and the planes come like right over or right by the airport. The planes come right over your head and land. It's an amazing experience because it's like right next to the runway is this park, and it's always full of people laying down, just having the planes come over their head. I went there one Saturday or Sunday with our kids, our young kids, and I said, hey, you guys go to that bush down there. And I'm going to come to this bush right here. And when I say go, you're going to race that airplane over your head. And if you can get to this bush before the airplane gets there, I'll give you $100. And they're like, oh my gosh. And these are little kids. These are my three kids, probably 10, 8, and 6 at the time or so. And so they all line up at the bush. And they're there. And they're watching the airplane. And I'm going to tell them go. And I say, go! And I'm giggling, right? Because it's like, these guys have no idea how fast these planes are moving, because the perception is that they're going really slow, but they're ripping by you, right? Well, all 3 of them beat the airplane. I miscalculated, and I told them go way too early. And they won. The next day, I'm driving by this park, and I tell this to Romney. And I tell him the story, and I say, and my kids, they beat the airplanes. I can't believe it. And he said, well, what'd you do? What did you do? And I said, well, clever. I told him, all right, $100 in your college savings account, $100 in yours, and $100 in yours. And and I'm laughing about this and giggling about this. And he, in the passenger seat, just stops dead in his tracks and looks at me with the most severe look I've ever, to this date, the most severe look I've ever seen him give. And he says, you have to pay them that money. And I said, what? He said, there is nothing in the world that will trade out their trust in their dad. You can't risk that trust at all. There's nothing that's worth it. And they'll love it. It'll be an amazing memory for them. He said, you pay them that money today. He's never said anything like that to me ever before. That started a series of conversations between the two of us and some thinking of his, and it will be summarized in one other story which I will tell, which also involves him. And I was, a couple years ago, sitting across the table from a couple guys that represented like a $25 to $50 million investment in my real estate business right now. Big meeting. At the end of the meeting, these guys going, we're all in suits, and I'm telling them how wonderful investment it would be. At the end of this, they say, what's the number one thing you learned from Mitt Romney in your years working for him? We'd not even talked about Mitt Romney. Like, not one time. It was like, totally caught me off guard. And so I answered honestly. And I said, actually, the number one thing I learned from Mitt Romney is how to treat my wife. And this was not the right crowd for that answer. This is not a sentimental type. They looked at me like so confused, like, what the heck? Like, I was like, quickly had to recalibrate, because like I thought this would be a great answer, a deep, I saw all your faces. That's the response I was expecting from them. These guys were like totally confused by that answer. Like, what the heck? You spent 15 years by this guy who's a big business leader and politician. That's what you learned? So I quickly adjusted and said, well, let me tell you the second most important thing I learned. I said, the plague of short-term thinking, or the plague of short-termism. That story with the airplane and my kids, that was me thinking in the moment, not thinking in the long term. As I went through my career in politics and now in business, that is the greatest plague that we have in so many ways, because we are making sacrifices tomorrow for what feels good today. And we can apply this to so many things. You can apply this to the gospel. You can apply this to relationships. But I saw that so often in the world of politics, and now I see it in the world of business. And I can give many examples of that. But let me tell you one from when we first got into the Senate, which is kind of fun. So I gave you, a little bit of my background. When Romney decided to run for the United States Senate, he was obviously a national figure, and you guys are sort of the age where you may or may not remember the 2012 campaign, but if you do, you're not old enough to really engross yourself in it. But he was the nominee. He was a BYU grad. He was a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and something which he has never forsaken or taken for granted. He's been an incredible ambassador of the church everywhere he's gone in all these different roles. He ran the Olympics. He ran the largest private equity fund in the world. He was a governor. He was a presidential candidate, almost became president. Were it not for 400,000 votes switching one way and the other way, he would have been president. And so he's running in this unusual race here, very unusual race, to go and run for Senate after you've done all these things. At a time where he had been a Trump antagonist, to say the least, and running in a very Republican state in which Trump was popular, still is popular, but not as much so as many other Republican states around the country. And, our campaign headquarters, which, by the way, we had 1,200 interns or volunteers during that campaign, most of which were BYU and UVU students. The campaign headquarters were just like 5 minutes away. And all the jobs we staffed out by people that signed up and said, I can be there Mondays from 6 p.m. to 10 p.m. And that's how we staffed an entire campaign. So look for those opportunities. They exist. Everybody will take free labor. And what happened is a lot of those interns went from a 4-hour-a-week intern to like, hey, what are you doing next semester? We'll take you a full time. And then two of them, two BYU students, went from couple-hour-a-week intern, full-time employee in the Senate, because they just got there and they were grinding, doing all the dirty work for a campaign. What was that?
Who are they? Kelsey?
Kelsey, are you talking Kelsey Berg? No, she was already beyond that. No, I don't even know if Trent McFadden and Brennan Stokes. Do you know Brennan? Brennan was an IR student here, and they both, Brennan just finished off the 6-year Romney Senate term and is now going on to his next thing. So I had one thing on my wall, only one thing on my wall during that campaign, and the idea was let Mitt be Mitt. And that meant let him just go out there and be himself who he is today, not beholden to the rules of politics, the rules of everything that frames our political world today. And sometimes that came with some headaches, and a lot of times that came with just honesty, and allowed him to call balls and strikes no matter who was throwing the pitch, whether it was Republican or Democrat. That's either a strike or that's a ball. And then when he won and we go to the Senate, he says to me, well, what are we going to do about the staff? I said, I don't know, what do you want to do? He says, let's just hire the best people we know to these positions. I don't care what their backgrounds are. I don't care if they have particular expertise in the Senate here or there or other place. He said, let's just start with fresh faces. I don't want a whole bunch of people that have just worked in the Senate their whole career, because then they're going to think like this rather than having just an open viewpoint of things. So we said, great. We said, we probably need to get 1 or 2 people that know the ropes around here, but that's it. And so he said, well, what I'm going to do, I'd like to meet with all 99 other senators in my first 60 days. And when he said about this, we started sending emails to these other senators. They're like, well, what does he want to meet about? Like, I don't know, there's only 100 of us. Aren't we going to work together? He wants to just sit down and get your vision for what the heck you're doing here in the Senate. It was like head scratcher after head scratcher from these other senators that they're supposed to be working with every day of, why on earth he wants to just sit down and just hear from me what I think about things? Yeah, that's it. And he said, for you go meet with all the other chiefs of staff you can meet. This is before he even got sworn in. Go to D.C. and just meet with all of them. Democrat, Republican, Bernie Sanders, Ted Cruz, you meet with them all. Well, one particular experience left an indelible mark in my brain as we were going into the Senate. And it was about budgeting. I said, so tell me, how do I know how much money I have to hire? They said, well, they give you a budget, and that's your budget, and you can hire however you want. I said, okay, well, what do you use for a budget to hire? And I'm asking this to every other Senate chief of staff. They say, oh, just find somebody that's a Senate officer same size and copy what they did. So if they had a comms director, communications director getting paid this much, do that. They have a legislative assistant getting paid this much, do that. If they have 2, legislative correspondents making this much, do that. And I said, well, no, what's your budget? Can you show me your budget and how you make your decisions based on, what your overhead is and how do you know how much to pay people? And they said, oh, everyone kind of knows the same positions kind of get paid the same. And I'm talking about this with Mitt, and it's like, Wait, no. How much can we pay people? Not what's the norm here. And so ultimately, I kept asking this question over and over and over again. And one guy, I was about to say the name of whose senator he represented. I'm not going to do that. One guy who became a good friend of mine, I'm having this conversation. I'm saying, no, how did you budget who to hire? Please tell me how you're budgeting who to hire. And he says, just copy what somebody else has done. You don't need to overcomplicate this. And I said, well, I'm looking at it, I'm thinking we can pay people like twice as much as they're normally getting paid. The rumor out there is that you have to make like $28,000 starting to work on Capitol Hill, and you got to do your part. I said, I'm running the numbers here, and it seems like we could pay people a lot more. He said, well, yeah, but then that'd be a huge disadvantage for them, because if they're at this level in your office making this much, and then they want to move up into another office, and they're going to make less, then you're putting these people in a bad position. I said, not my problem. You know, that's the problem with the other office, and maybe we'll keep them longer. So I said, but what about your overhead costs? What about everything else? And I said, what if you have money left over at the end of the year? And this other Senate chief of staff says, oh, money left over at the end of the year? Come with me. And we walked through this office after office after office in the Capitol buildings, office buildings. All the offices are connected by doorways you can shut. So we go through this long thing, and we come to this closet. He brings me in. Big smile on his face. Opens up the door, shows me. I have no idea what's going on here. And I walk into this closet, and floor to ceiling, ink cartridges. At the end of the year, with their leftover money, instead of paying their people, they bought hundreds of ink cartridges so they would never need ink cartridges ever again. And I am sitting, and he's smiling at me like, see what I've done here? And I'm smiling at him like, you're the biggest idiot I've ever met in my life. And that was like totally eye-opening for me going into the United States Senate, where there is so much that is done just because this is the way it's done. And so I had the advantage of knowing, I'm going to do this for a couple years, and I am never going to do it again. I don't want the next job that this leads to. I don't even probably want to work in politics anymore. I'm just here because Mitt Romney, I think, is a good guy. I think he can make a difference, and I'm going to go do something totally different afterwards. So it gave me the courage and necessitated me raising my hand very often in meetings where I'd say, and why do we do it that way? And almost every time the room would kind of look around each other and be like, it's just the way it's done. And so if you take that as a little microcosm of how much politics is like, just follow here, do this, stay in line, you're part of this party, this is how you act, this is what you do, this is what you say. And there are very few instances of people that get out of line. Mitt Romney is one of those guys that got out of line all the time. In fact, he broke the system. He fundamentally broke the system. Let me talk about the system just for a second, because I want you to all work in politics and make a difference someday. The system can be explained many different ways. This is the most important way to explain the political system to me. And I'm going to talk about Congress. I'm going to talk specifically about the Senate. For many, 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 many years, decades, all Republican senators met for lunch every Tuesday. All Republican senators met for lunch every Thursday. And every Wednesday, Democratic and Republican senators met together for decades. Sometimes their spouses came. And that was the time when Republican and Democratic senators got to know each other, got to understand each other's priorities. Why was that important? Because George Washington once described the Senate as the saucer to cool the boiling water, the boiling tea that is the House. So the House of Representatives, where you can pass laws with a simple majority rule, Washington described as a boiling, bubbling, bursting over cup of hot tea. And the boiling tea would spill over into the saucer, which would cool it. And he described the Senate as that saucer. And that is the filibuster, which has been oft discussed in the last 2 years, which is 60 votes to pass a law, which almost always means you have to have some compromise. So that Wednesday lunch these Republicans and Democrats had, that was the time for them to understand their priorities, one and another, in order to get those 60 votes to get something passed and have compromise, the dirty word. Well, about the Tea Party movement was what, like 2010 or so, a gentleman named Jim DeMint was the head of something called the Tea Party movement. And the Tea Party movement was a right-wing fiscal conservative group that buoyed up a bunch of candidates for House and Senate across the country, and they came in a big wave of financial reform, fiscal responsibility, and they came in with their own set of rules, and then several of them got elected, and when they were in there, Jim DeMint, who is the leader of this, said, we're not going to that Wednesday lunch. We are not going to that Wednesday lunch. We're going to hold our own Wednesday lunch just for our people. We're going to call it the steering committee, and that's where we're going to decide our policy objectives. Well, one by one, that pressure mounted for that Wednesday lunch for the Republican senators to not go to the lunch with the Democrats, but just to go to the steering committee one, because that's where all the action was happening. That's where the policy was getting set for the Republican Party. No one ever elected Jim DeMint. No, all the senators didn't vote for him to be the guy to do this. But then eventually, leadership in both parties said, the heck with it then. Nobody's coming to our Wednesday lunch, so let's just split into our own lunches. So now, each party has their own lunch, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. That Wednesday lunch, the steering committee lunch, again, led by someone who was never elected by any of the other Republicans, was turned over, that Jim DeMint, turned it over to his person that he thought would follow in his suit and continue that. That was Utah Senator Mike Lee. So Mike Lee leads that Wednesday lunch every week, where they set what he deems as the policy agenda for the Republican Party. It's a little bit awkward, but to me, that is what is happened here in Washington, is everybody goes to their corners, no one talks, everyone stays apart, and if you do try to get together, the two parties, the leadership of those parties who want to control everything really, really don't like it. So that's just some interesting inside politics there. I'm going to stop because I could just keep going to things like this and get right into questions, because I bet I can weave in a lot of the stuff I did want to cover into your questions. If you don't have questions, I'll just keep going. In the back.
How did you get started with Mitt Romney?
Great question, which I did not address. So Quinn mentioned this story at BYU. I would not say I was a particularly political person, meaning I didn't have very super strong political viewpoints. I did have a really strong viewpoint that everyone should get engaged. And I said, okay, I align with the Republican Party. To me, the Republican Party then is very different than the Republican Party today. I couldn't see myself, frankly, organizing for the party that I belonged to for such a long time today as I did then, but we'll leave that aside for the time being. So I did this, in 2006 was the big one. We had 770 BYU students who went out to 35 different cities around the country to campaign. They just signed up, and they got assigned randomly a city from Baltimore to Knoxville, Tennessee. We flew them out, and they went and worked hard for 3 days there. Abby, where did you go? Connecticut? Yeah. And we barely knew each other then, but she was one of those students. And when that ended, that was 2006 election, 2008 and 2012 were the presidential elections. Actually, a guy who has now become a really good friend of mine heard about, these BYU students organized all these things. Let's reach out to them. Maybe they'll be Mitt Romney fans. I knew Mitt Romney only because he ran the Salt Lake Olympics in 2002, which I was a BYU student for. I was a freshman. They let us out of school for a couple weeks to go volunteer at the Olympics. It was awesome. So I'm like, that was one of the great experiences of my life. And this Mitt Romney guy's leading. I was like, oh, he's awesome. He's running for politics now. Great. So when his campaign proactively reached out and said, hey, we heard about what you guys did. We'd like to get you involved in his presidential campaign. I said, yeah, sure, great. Really not a lot of thought into it. And so actually BYU had the very first Students for Mitt chapter. And so I started the Students for Mitt, which then spread across the country, and I ultimately ended up running one of the 2 nationwide student programs for his campaign for free, because I liked it and I thought, this would be great. It's a great way to learn things and get involved. I like this guy. I hadn't really met him at that point in time. And then that was 2008. Then he lost in the primary there. Between 2008 and 2012, I started with the Ryan that he mentioned. We started up a little political consultant firm. Really gutsy thing to do. I still can't believe we did it. One of our staple clients was Mitt Romney. He was preparing to run again in 2012. He wrote a book. We managed his book tour for him. We did things, and then we did a few other clients along the way. But it was all sort of preparing to come back and work on his 2012 campaign. So I worked for him that whole time in between. In 2012, when he lost to Obama, like everybody else, I thought we were going to work in the White House. I had an idea of what my job would have been in the White House. It was going to be awesome. We actually had started renting a place down in D.C. from Boston, and didn't work out that way. And everyone, I thought I was going to go job hunting, and through a series of events, within a couple of days, I got asked to stick around and continue working with him in his orbit. His quote to me at that time was, "I lost an election, I didn't die." So I'm going to still do stuff. And that turned, what I thought was going to be a couple-month project-based work turned into, a decade. There was another hand here. Okay, question answered. Okay, I'm going to tell you one other thing then. I'm going to check my notes here. I told you the ink story, which was sort of the negative thing that I saw. I want to tell one other thing. I think maybe I've done two things right in my life, which I know were right. Everything else, you're like, that was fine. And so I'll share one in case it is a lesson to anybody here. And I think it's, other than decision number one, which is who to marry, being the most important thing you do in your life, this was my probably second most important thing, which I, for whatever reason, got this idea in my head, while possibly even in this classroom. I was often in the Kennedy Center. I did Model UN. If any of you have not even thought about doing that, nothing against my political science degree, because I really enjoyed it. Honest to goodness, like 90% of my BYU education when I came out of it was from Model UN. Like truly, it was transformative to me, because the way the classes run, everything is great, but then you get and you compete against every other school in the whole country and internationally in this international Model United Nations contest, I guess, competition. And I remember walking in there being very intimidated when I saw all at Yale, Harvard, University of Milan, and all these people that were clearly far brighter than I am. And then I watched BYU students just run circles around them, because we had the ability to connect on a personal level that a lot of these students
lack. The way I would generalize that is, I think there's a significant amount of your education that happens outside of the classroom.
Totally.
So whether it's Model UN or something else, there's lots of things to do on campus.
Study abroads and everything that's offered. There's a thousand things. I often would say that, and in fact, this is how we recruited people back in 2006 for that. We would shout out, "Don't let school get in the way of your education," which is a Mark Twain quote, which is a great one. But that all goes hand in hand. During my very, very, very last few months at BYU, I somehow got this thought in my head, which I can only think was placed in there by providence. I mean, and now as I look back on it, this was God giving me something, no question. And we all know that He does that, so that's why I believe it. I had this idea that I was going to work until I was 35 years old. And the number 35 popped in my head when I'm 24. So I'm going to work till I'm 35 years old, only for the benefit of other people. And everything I do is going to be to prop up other people and do things on behalf of other people and make them better at what they do and push whatever their agenda is. And what that allowed me to do is have extraordinary freedom for that first 10 years or so out of school. Meaning, I didn't negotiate ever. When a contract, when a salary, anything, I said, great, terrific, good. No negotiation. You know what a burden that relieved? Because you're not worrying about, do they value me, do they not value me? I should be valued more because I need more money here. It was like, no, joke's on you. This is my education you're paying for right now. My education is going until I'm 35 years old by getting as much information from you as possible. That period in between the 2012 campaign with Mitt Romney and when he became a senator, there was a 6-year period there. I was working in private equity, venture capital. I'm a poli-sci major. I had no good reason to be there. And you know what I got paid? Almost nothing, truly almost nothing. At a big private equity firm, really, really great experience. To me, that was educational. I was learning and just sucking everything in. And it just was this pressure release, this valve that just was constantly open, where it worked for me to say, you know what, anything I go into, it's going to be like, I'm not looking after my own. with the recognition that at some point in time, you do need to do that, and it's not a bad thing. You do need to say, okay, now I'm going to focus on my career and what I do next and what I want to accomplish, right? But there's some lesson in that, I think, that can be applied to whatever you want to do, which is there is a period of life where we can just be happy learning. And it's not just here in the classroom. That goes on for many years. And of course, we want to learn forever. But to me, I think that was one of the very few things that I did absolutely right. And then when I was 35, of course, that's right at the time that Mitt Romney had his campaign here in Utah. And so I had to put it off a few more years before I really started thinking about my own career. But that was okay, because it just set me up in a unique way. I have a question then for you. Has anybody ever worked in any capacity on a campaign? Anybody ever considered working in Washington, D.C. on Capitol Hill? Has anybody interned on Capitol Hill or anything like that yet? Any experience like that from among you? Because I do want to talk a little bit about if you do want to work in these government Capitol Hill jobs. You've done it, or you're thinking about it?
Doing Washington seminar this summer.
And looking for the internship.
For internships, yeah.
Okay. And are you thinking, I mean, there's a lot of different ways you can go. That's why Washington Seminar is so great, because you really could work in any field you could ever imagine. DC has everything. DC is the coolest city, by the way. Like, figure out a way to get there. There's so much energy and things going on. Okay, so Capitol Hill, just real quick. I'll just give you, we talked about campaigns a little bit. I would say this, like, even if you have like the slightest interest in just seeing what it's like, either reach out to me, Quinn, or find like a mayor's race, a congressional race, or whatever. Don't worry about being 100% aligned at this stage with the candidate. So you're not embarrassed and so you can be honest, but like, just, if you show up and say, hey, I'm here, I'm a warm body to help, you'll be blown away at the responsibility given on like day 2. So I really mean that, and it is, no matter what the long-term plan is, if there's any inkling in your brain that might be interesting, I would definitely go ahead and try to do that. With working on Capitol Hill, there is the normal hiring, which is like, okay, I've been an intern in someone's office, and usually they hire from the intern pool, almost always. And then you get that first job, which is usually a staff assistant. You're in the front office answering phones and welcoming people, and you move your way up. I would say that probably 80% of the people that I know that got hired into any congressional office or Senate office, and then this goes to the White House and executive and those places, it is through a connection. You have to have somebody that recommends you. You have to have somebody that picks up the phone and says, yeah, I know her. She'd be terrific. Are you looking for anyone? Keep her on your short list. And having the experience, the internship, or whatever the case, is great. But honestly, that's how you get most internships too. I think Romney Senate office, for every semester, we probably got 400 resumes or applications for the internships, of which there were 5 or 6. I can't remember how we did. We did like 5 or 6. It was impossible to go through the resumes and be like, oh, okay, this person has a 3.9, this person has a 3.91. Like, who do you want to go with? It's like, okay, let's figure out who comes recommended by the professor at BYU that we know. I would bet, I don't know this, but I would bet at some I bet at some point.
Maybe more.
I would say at some point in time he's called and said, when I was in Romney's office, hey, you should really think about this person. It's like, oh, that's easy. Whew, takes that burden off my plate, and that's a large part of what it is. It's like taking the time to sift through the resumes and make sure you make the right decision. I'd much rather be able to call Quinn after 4 months when somebody was a terrible intern, be like, hey, you gave me a bad one, your fault, not mine, right?
And I'm not going to recommend somebody that I think will ruin the pipeline. So I need to believe that they're going to be great, or I'm not going to make the call, because I don't want to ruin it. I don't want to ruin my reputation or the reputation of my ability to make that happen.
Totally. There are 75,000 members of the church in the greater DC area. That is, outside of Utah and Mesa, Arizona, the largest concentration in the country. Or at least that was true as of 2 years ago. I know things have shifted. It's an extraordinary place where a lot of extraordinary things are getting done. What's most interesting to me with what's going on in the news right now is that we had so many members of our wards out there working for USAID. And I am thinking about that right now. I mean, I can think of a few dozen families working for this organization that are now going, I wonder what's going on if you're following the news on this. That's just a little side note, but I bring this up because the community out there is a single stake. There is a single stake right there in Arlington, Virginia.
The neighborhood called Little Provo.
Yeah, it was a neighborhood called Little Provo. So it's a great place, regardless of whether you want to go into politics, whether you want to go into nonprofits, whether you want to go into national defense, national security, broad government, whether you want to go into business consulting, and now my current life, the investment world. It is a very fast-growing investment community there as well. So DC is a great place to keep on your radar no matter what you want to do. Any other questions? We've got to wrap up soon. Either I have covered everything or I've bored you all to death. Yes?
Did you ever feel like challenged in your religious beliefs, like in the political sphere, or was that not really an issue?
I would love to say yes to that question, that I did feel challenged. It's mostly due to my personality. I think luckily, I rarely felt challenged in much of anything in that regard in my life. I have a very easy time talking about the gospel. I just am fortunate in that way. What was the hardest part for me is to have phone calls, of which I took literally hundreds, and I took and I read dozens upon hundreds of pieces of mail and emails that both used the F word, talking about my boss, and quoted the Book of Mormon in the same paragraph. This is hundreds of examples. People that were taking our faith and, in my view, just like totally missing the mark. I mean, just completely missing and using, and we've seen this throughout history, and it was really, that was the most challenging thing for me, is to also sit down with people I respected and I loved in many cases too, and have them in an instance where the only problem with Mitt Romney was that he was not going along with Donald Trump. That no other issues, like, oh no, the way he votes, his policy, that was fine. And I'm going, well, he's not doing this because he feels that that is a moral obligation on one. How can we judge one another when a decision is made based on a moral stand, right? And I thought that's a great argument. Well, what would be flipped on its head back to me is like, no, let me tell you the moral stand I'm making by telling you that he is the Antichrist, and he's riding his religion on his arm and saying he's doing all these things because he is a man of faith, when in fact what he's doing is promoting the liberal ideology of XYZ, and I'm just going, my goodness. So that was challenging because we only had like 3 members of the church in the Senate office when I was there. And so for many of those staffers, it was their first exposure to the church. And there were so many times where I was like, oh, I promise this is not a representation of our doctrine. I promise, But it led to a lot of amazing things, and it led to a lot of amazing discussions. And, this was covered in a book about Mitt that came out not too long ago. And I don't know if any of you went to McKay Coppen's speech last year about this, but here at BYU. It was really cool to have him explain to the staff, most of whom were not LDS, why his son and I went into his office right before he went out on the floor of the United States Senate to have him note that he was going to vote to impeach Donald Trump is because we gave him a blessing. And have him explain to everyone that in this moment, he needed a little bit more from God. And that was cool for me. So, like anything, if you look for the opportunities, our faith can present itself in wonderful ways, but it's not without challenges. So, I see laptops closing. Yeah. I don't know what you want to do. I'm serious. There may not be any interest, but if like anything strikes your mind, like, I'd kind of like to explore it, I would be more than happy to help and guide and help you navigate what is a pretty cutthroat world, and right now is a crazy world. And I don't know that I could stand working in politics right now, but it sure is fascinating.
I'm sure Matt can hang around for a few minutes and talk one-on-one if you need, or if you have to go and you want to be in touch with him, I have his contact info too.
By all means. Okay, thank you very much.